Hi, my name is Dave. I'm your host. You're listening to The Last Podcast, where the first shall be last and the last shall be first. If this is your first time listening, welcome. I'm happy you found us. And if you're returning, welcome back. I really appreciate you listening, and I hope you continue to find tips, ideas, and value from listening to this podcast. Today, I want to talk about for those who want to start their own podcast. I have a few ideas that might assist you. When I first started my podcast, my grandson told me that you should start a podcast, because I told him I wanted to start one, and this was like many moons ago, but I let fear get in the way, and I spoke about this before. So that was one of my biggest mistakes. And I think that I've lost a lot of time, and I should have just went past those mistakes. I should have forged forward, and I didn't. So that was a mistake I've made. I don't want you to make that mistake either. If you desire to start your own podcast, of course, by all means, go ahead and do so. When I first started, one of my mistakes was not really looking at the names of the podcast. I just popped the name in my head and said, I'm going to call it The Last Podcast. I love that name. I love it. So I went with it. And I did like a small search. But at the time when I first put that name in, The Last Podcast, I didn't see anybody with that particular name, and now I see everybody with that name. I see The Last Podcast on the left, and somebody recently just started a podcast with their name saying The Last Podcast. But the funny thing is, when you know how you get ready to go ahead and buy a car, you don't really see anybody with that car, or a jacket, you don't see anybody with that particular jacket. So you go ahead and purchase it, and next thing you know, you see everybody with that particular jacket or car. So I think that was the same thing what happened to me when I was looking for a name, and I chose The Last Podcast. So the first thing I would tell you is make sure you look the name up first, and then move forward from there. But the first thing you want to really do is define what your podcast is going to be about. What is the concept? Decide on the topic or niche that you want to create your podcast around. It should be something that you're passionate about and have knowledge or interest in. So I think that is the one thing that might work for you. When my wife passed away last year, I felt this strong urge to create a podcast. I had to do something because although she was sick and it was really bad for her and she was in a lot of pain, I was in pain too. All her family members were in pain too, watching her go through this. And I was in the hospital for 84 days with her. So I started this podcast, and my grandson said, why don't you start the podcast? This way it gets you to talk, and it gets you to talk about how you feel or whatever the case may be. You read so much. Why don't you just start the podcast and talk about what you read? So I started this podcast, The Last Podcast, and that's how I actually started. I just jumped right in, and I didn't even look at podcast hosting companies. I just was listening to a podcast, and on the way to the hospital, I heard the guy says you can go ahead and start your podcast for free, and that's exactly what I did. I didn't even look to the left, looked all to the right. I just said, I'm gonna go with this platform, and that's that. So if I were you, I would definitely define what podcast or what your concept on your podcast is going to be in. And I suggest that you definitely look at the areas that you're passionate about or you have some knowledge of. For me, it was I wanted to talk about change because that's where I was. I am always talking about change, how one changes their life, how one can change their life for the better, and how can we change and make lasting change throughout the rest of our lives. So that is what I really wanted to create my podcast around. And then the idea of trying to create a podcast many years ago, I wanted a poetry podcast. So I thought about what better way for me to go ahead and fuse both of those ideas together by deeming a specific day for just poetry. And that's what I did. I created Poetry Fridays for this podcast. And I think that my numbers, I don't advertise my podcast. I will get into that later, but my numbers are starting to pick up a little. So that's a good thing. I think you want to also, and we talked about defining your podcast and what concept, right, you want your podcast to be in. The second thing I would say is you have to probably outline your episodes. You want to make sure that they're a specific length. You got to decide whether you want them to be a specific length or a particular format, whether you're doing solo commentary or interviews or storytelling, or create a list of potential episode topics is the best way to come up with your ideas. Now, you can also have guests on your shows, or it could be more than, instead of a solo commentary, you can have several people on a panel that talk, and a lot of those are fun and successful. I don't have that right now. That might be something I might think about in the future as well. And then you can also think about how you want your podcasts to be. What I would also think about is, after you define your concept and after you decide what your episodes are going to be like, you also have to figure out what kind of equipment you're going to use. Now, for when I first started, I just started with my phone. I didn't have any equipment whatsoever. I started with the phone. I've always had a microphone, and because I was into poetry, so I've always had a microphone. But what I've learned is the mic that you use, you want it to be clear. You want it to be somewhat on a professional level. So I actually went and purchased a Yeti. You can go on Amazon or any store, or whatever the case may be, and I would suggest you look at or go to YouTube University and see what other people might be using. Me, I fell in love with the Yeti. The Blue Yeti. It is clear, it's easy, and it's nothing to program or anything of that nature. It's a plug and go, and that's it. I like that. I like anything that's going to make my job a whole lot easier, make me sound great, but also you want to be able to have a platform where you're creating your podcast. I use several things, and I grew up to do this because when I first started the podcast, I started with just my phone. Now, when I do the poetry, I use a program that's called Audacity. And I also use Magic Music Maker for some of my music, and now I use another program as well. So you have to figure out what type of platform you want to use. You want to see if you can start your podcast for free and then scale up from there. You want to look at the rates too, the software that you're using. You want to make sure all that is within your particular budget. You also want to look at headphones, recording software. Look at all of that and see how you want to start. What do you want to scale with, or don't? And my thing is this: whatever you do, definitely don't let anything deter you from creating your podcast. That's what I did. Fear deterred me. Don't let that happen to you. All right. So you want to definitely set up your recording editing software. You can use free software like what I use, which is Audacity. I use that for my editing, and you can use Skype, Zoom, but there are a ton of other things that you would like, probably better than what I'm using. So there are a lot of different programs that people use, and what I would do, instead of making my mistake, because I made this mistake, I didn't look at software. I just jumped in with what I had. So what I'm asking you to do is to definitely do your homework on what kind of software you want to use, what kind of platform you want to be on, and then you can create your cover art. So your cover art is basically what everybody is going to see when they look at your podcast. If you are on different platforms or whatever, it'll be a picture that everybody would see. Use that. It could be a picture of yourself. It could be any type of cover art that you want for your podcast. And for your music, I would say try to find royalty-free music if you don't already make your own for your introductions and your outro. So you can do that. I create my own, and I enjoy it. So at one point, I was saying, well, maybe let me look at buying an intro or an outro, but I had the software already, and I was already into creating beats and things of that nature and putting little stuff together, so I decided to create my own. All right, so those are some ideas that I had that might be of assistance in helping you. But like I said, the best place to go is definitely YouTube University. You can choose your hosting platform, Buzzsprout, Podbean, or you can use a number of different choices. And I would really say, and what I'm using right now, mine is based on Podomatic. And one of the reasons why I chose them, it was free to start, so I didn't have to pay anything to start at all, so which was cool. So in the very beginning, I just talked. I didn't know what I wanted to talk about at the time. I had an idea, but that's not where I was heading because of what I was dealing with and losing my wife. So I wasn't ready to talk about how we can change our life and things of that nature, because I was in a grieving situation. So it was just therapeutic for me to talk about what I was dealing with. So for you have an opportunity to start so fresh, and you have an opportunity to choose everything from, what theme you want, from the equipment you use, and from the platforms you decide to use. And you also, once you create all of that and you've got everything down, it's time to submit your podcast to directories. Yes, you definitely need to submit them. And what I've learned, and I'm going to tell you my mistake so you don't make my mistake. What I've learned is when you submit your podcast to directories, it's based on algorithms, it's based on how many likes, it's based on how many people listen to your podcast, whether you're going to even show up in their directories. So you can start out by making sure, if you have a long list of family and friends, get them all to like the podcast, get them all to subscribe to the podcast, and get them to spread the word about your podcast. For me, I didn't have many friends, so it's like my podcast is growing organically, and there's nothing wrong with that, but I think you would grow much faster and by leaps and bounds if you have a force behind that. So definitely you want to submit them like to Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts. Matter of fact, Google Podcasts no longer has directory. Everything has been shifted over to YouTube. So because most people are creating their own podcast and they're doing video with their podcast, which is better because people always like to look at the people that they're listening to. So I just don't have that yet. So that may be something in the future. So that's another thing you're going to have to decide whether you're going to be using video, because now you're talking about more software that you would probably, and it's not that much, because there are so many companies coming out now that make everything seamless and make it a whole lot easier for you to create your own podcast. Promoting your podcast. I can't talk much on this, but what I can share with you about promoting your podcast is, if you're on social media, let the world know. I don't, again, I have my reasons, but let the world know. And if you're on Facebook, you're on TikTok or anything of that nature, go ahead and create a page for your podcast. And I guarantee you'll probably grow leaps and bounds. Make sure you just incorporate all your people to share it, like family and friends or things of that nature, co-workers, associates, stuff like that. But what I also would end this with is, make sure whatever you do, you're consistent and always look to improve. Publish your episodes on a regular basis and keep your audience engaged. Continuously work on improving your podcasting skills and content. And this I am really, really trying to do. And hopefully I will have the time to become a whole lot better at what it is that I love so much. So starting a podcast for me, I believe, involves a learning curve. So and I'm learning every day. I'm learning whenever I get an opportunity to figure out better ways to learn about and create a podcast and so on and so forth, and even become more creative. I think it's a great idea. It's something that you must hold on to and continue to grow. You can create your podcast that resonates with your audience, or you can create something like poetry, or reading, or even Bible, or whatever platform or whatever ideas that you have. I believe that creating a podcast has changed my future immensely. And what I mean by that is, it's not only therapeutic no more, but it gives me an opportunity to touch lives. It gives me an opportunity to invoke thought and have people think about, how could I build a platform? Because I have my own story to tell, and I listen to everybody else's story. I listen to all these things that's going on, but what about your story? Starting your own podcast, you can only do anything but go up from there and grow from there, because your story is impactful. Your story is powerful, and you can change so many minds and lives just with your story alone. So do me a favor, don't deprive society from your voice. It's up to you. I thank you so much for listening. Share this podcast, and do me a favor, subscribe, like, and I thank you so much for listening. You all have been a blessing to me, whether you know it or not. So thanks a lot. Have a great day. Bye-bye.